Starting the waiting room,
Oh,
and that was started the recording as well. So that's good. So let me go into presentation mode here. Everyone see the presentation?
Yeah.
nice. Yes.
Okay, terrific. So what we're talking about is really what they were davening, what they were praying in Qumran, the liturgy, these type of issues is really what we're talking about specifically today. So when we talk about prayer during this during the end of the Second Temple period, we have to remember, and we've said this, but we have to remember, this is still a temple-centered religion, a cultic religion, which doesn't, by the way, denote any crazy customs. When we use the word cult nowadays, you think of wacko types doing really bizarre things that most people find shocking. That's not what it means. It just means it was a religion which really centered around sacrificial service as the prime form of worship. So even so so the the particular issue, as we've said for the Qumran sect, is that even though the primary form of worship was taking place at the temple, as far as they were concerned, the temple in Jerusalem was polluted, it was impure, the rituals were being done wrong, it was being carried out by people who weren't ritually pure. Yes, perhaps they had the right family pedigree, most of these people coming from the priestly circles, but they simply weren't up to the job. They didn't do a good enough job of keeping themselves pure. So therefore, they eventually break away to form their own community out in the desert so they could worship in a purer fashion. So we should note that during this time period, synagogues or shuls start to develop during the later Second Temple period. They could date the earliest shuls that we know of to about the middle of third century before the Common Era, Alexandria, Egypt. It's not till first century Common Era that we know for a fact there were synagogues in Eretz Israel in Israel, even though there certainly could have been, and it's been suggested there may have been some form of synagogues in Babylon as soon as the people were exiled from Jerusalem, being that they had to find some sort of replacement. So it certainly makes a lot of sense, but we don't know that for a fact. So it's also important to keep in mind that synagogue, it's a Greek word, but it follows basically the same Hebrew, a bet knesset, as a house of assembly, which could denote multiple different type of activities. When we think of a synagogue, we primarily think of it as a prayer place, particularly in Israel. Basically, that's nowadays in modern Israel. That's the function basically of a synagogue. It's a place where you go daven. In America, it often takes on has more of a social element as well, and that's probably in Israel. The whole country is like a Jewish center to a certain degree. In America, you need a specific designated Jewish centers.
Rabbi, can I interrupt?
Yes.
I thought, wasn't he calling for readings of the Torah to the people? And weren't they sort of gathering to read the Torah? I guess that doesn't count as prayer. But did they just open? I guess we don't know. Did they just open the scroll and start reading?
So that's an excellent point, Jonathan. So this really is you're going back to the step before and tracing this long line of evolution as Judaism is slowly evolving from a sacrificial religion. And then during the time of Ezra, which is, let's say, 400 before the Common Era, what Ezra does is he basically challenges the authority of the priesthood, which is kind of strange because he happened to be a Kohen, a priest himself, but he was also a sofer, a scribe. So what he does is he basically empowers the laity, the non-Kohanim, by teaching people Torah. It's like maybe like a Protestant revolution almost, where you have lay people are really being educated at a much higher level. And also what's happening is, in order to find God's will, instead of relying on prophecy, as prophecy is coming to an end right around this time, you're going to have to work a little harder. It's not like you're going to have a prophet is going to walk in and say, hear ye, Ko Amar Hashem, thus says the Lord type of thing. You're going to have to engage in drasha, which are lidrosh, which is another word to investigate the text, to really hear God's voice through the text. So he starts that, and that what the ceremony he has at the water's gate, which the scholars also point out wasn't held at the temple gate, probably because the Kohanim, the priests, wanted no part of his reform, at least initially, because they realized their authority was being challenged. But what he's do, but what he's doing, where he's basically studying Torah reading Torah to the people and teaching them how to really study the Torah and hear God's voice and find principles, legal principles by studying the Torah on how to behave. The word in English is exegesis, which I know it's a funny word. It has nothing to do with Jesus, by the way. It means basically pulling a principle out of a text. So what's going on here kind of looks like a synagogue service, or something that you would see walk into a shul. You have Torah study, a reading of the Torah sounds like a service. Torah study sounds like maybe in the Bet Midrash next to the sanctuary you'd see nowadays, that type of thing. Or you go into a yeshiva, they daven in the same room, they study Torah. So it certainly looks like that type of thing. So it's not particularly surprising that, let's say, in 3rd century, not too much later on in history, 3rd century before the Common Era, we start to see these shuls spring up in Egypt, and then later on in Eretz Israel. And it wasn't particularly systemized. Some shuls really focused more as study halls, like a Bet Midrash. Others were places really more where prayer was emphasized. I think that may have been more the diaspora communities. They were emphasizing prayer, maybe because they couldn't get to the temple in Jerusalem as easily for worship. And they were also meeting places, literally meeting places, just the way I think of a town hall meeting at a church. There were records, I think, in Christian scriptures of somewhere in the Galilee, they're having basically a debate over what to do about the Romans, that type of thing. What's our response to something the Romans are doing? So you have all these 3 different roles that the ancient synagogue takes on, and again, in some places it took on more of a prayer hall, some places more of a study hall, some places more of a meeting hall. But this seems to come out of Ezra's reform, but then they become more and more institutionalized, particularly, or institutionalized may be a strong word, but they become more and more a fixed part of Jewish life, even as the Second Temple stands. And finally, after the Second Temple is destroyed, particularly under Yochanan ben Zakkai and then Rabban Gamliel, about 90 of the Common Era, they take the place of sacrifice as the primary form of worship. And I say under Rabban Gamliel because he's the guy who really codified the current matbeach tefillah, which is the current format for the our tefillah. I'm talking particularly here about the Shemona Esrei, or the Amidah. By the way, when the Mishnah uses the word tefillah, it's always talking specifically about the Amidah or Shemona Esrei. So at that point, that really takes over, as sacrifice is no longer an option at all. Does that help, Jonathan?
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure.
Rabbi,
Yes, Susan.
I wanted to add something that you might find interesting on the side, which is we've done a lot of teaching on the word church or ecclesia, which was the word used often in the same sense that synagogue was, and in fact is, I would say, almost a translation of the word synagogue and ecclesia are the same. And a lot of Christians get very confused about this. And it's just been part of a very active conversation, if you will, about the idea of what an ecclesia was, which is exactly what you say, which is sometimes it was religious and sometimes it was secular and sometimes it was just a gathering place. But we get all tangled up in this word church, but it doesn't really mean that. It actually means the same thing as synagogue.
Right. Yes. And there is, between church and synagogue, through the Greek, I believe, there is a connection. Years ago, I learned about it. I don't remember it off the top of my head. It's Greek to me, as they say again nowadays, but there is some sort of root connection between the two words. Or some
yes, absolutely. And Yeah, and I think that it'd be interesting to do just a word study on it sometime, because a lot of people get it very confused.
Right, right. So that's a good point. And even, I mean, even nowadays, you just made me, when you were saying that, you made me think of something. And I don't mean to start a political debate. It's just an interesting, tangentially related here. Is I was listening to one of these Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik lectures, and he talks about how he was called before the United States Congress because Congress was trying to define, in certain ways, what's a religious institution, and this issue revolved around who would be exempt from health insurance mandates and providing birth controls as religious institutions. Um, some religious institutions, particularly probably Catholic ones, wanted to be exempt from this federal mandate. So he and I think some Christian leaders were talking about how religion is not just defined as necessarily a place where you pray, but it also takes into account these study aspects, and also also places where you're going to or activities that you're inspired to do by your study, like tzedakah, good works type of stuff as well. So fascinating the way you really define the synagogue or church, and then even nowadays, practically how you define it has all sorts of societal effects. Okay. So as I said, synagogues pop up, particularly in the Galilee up north, which is you think about Israel even nowadays, but you had a major center. Obviously, the major center in the capital was always Jerusalem, but the Galilee is always, particularly during this time period, is a very active period. You think of it as a different province, let's say, and it has its own culture, and we have synagogues seem to start popping up there. Now, interestingly enough, no shul per se was found at Qumran, but when you stop and think about it, it's probably not surprising at all, simply because this is a very communal type of communal community. And if you've ever been to, let's say, a bet midrash in a yeshiva, you think about you don't need necessarily a shul at all there, because you have all these sefarim, these books, and you have Torah. Often you have Torah scrolls anyway, so this place can double basically as a bet midrash, a study place, as well as a place where you daven. So in Qumran, they had this community type of structure. They had these scriptoriums, which it wouldn't be surprising if those are places where they prayed. So we're not in any way suggesting that they didn't have some sort of on-campus shul or shuls. It's just that they didn't necessarily have, or they haven't found anything that was specifically designated as a shul. Like nowadays, you think you're walking into the shul and there's a plaque that someone gave money for this and that, and it's very overtly a shul. That was not found there. And I mentioned synagogue means gathering place. And we have the Yachad. That's the name of this community, coming from the Hebrew word Achad. Oneness is the substitute for the temple. So basically, they set up their own dissenting community to substitute the temple in the middle of the desert by the Dead Sea. Okay, and the Damascus document says, this is important here, anyone entering the house of protestation, which implies a place to pray, must not be impure, but be washed. This is ritually washed, and this is their big thing. They are obsessed with ritual purity here. So they're saying that you're going to come in, you have to make sure you've done the proper ablutions, go to the mikveh, whatever it is, the ritual bath, whatever it is. And even though it's not explicitly mentioned here, you could certainly see they're taking a shot again at the temple in Jerusalem. And the implication is they're not impure. They don't do it right. You come here, we do it correctly. So this is how you do it correctly. Okay, so it's akin to the temple. So it said it's akin to the temple, and the rabbinic view of a shul or synagogue at this point, at least, is not really clear. That becomes clarified, as I said, really under Yochanan ben Zakkai, 70 BCE, was the temple was destroyed, and then even more so under Rabban Gamliel. Okay, so when did they pray? Well, it's likely they prayed during the morning and evening. And when we say evening here, we're talking about really the later afternoon, probably before sunset here. simply because it seems to be understood that as prayer is developing, originally it develops. You have a morning prayer to correspond with the morning service, with the morning sacrifice offered at the temple every day, and then a mincha, an afternoon sacrifice. You have a mincha service, which corresponds to that. Mincha comes from lanuach, which denotes a sense of well-being or rest or to comfort, like Menachem Evel, to comfort a mourner. So it's the second sacrifice, it's the last sacrifice of the day. So you kind of put your spiritual obligations at rest here. So so you have two prayers to correspond to the two different sacrifices. Later on, Mariv is developed. It's developed not in direct correlation to a nighttime sacrifice. There were no nighttime, there was no regular nighttime sacrifice, probably simply because you didn't have sufficient lighting before the light bulb was developed. People much more as it got dark went home, and any communal activities really shut down. So, but the Ma'ariv corresponds to more of Trumat Hadashan and the clean the burning off of the limbs and basically the cleanup stuff towards the end of the day or in the evening. Ma'ariv corresponds to that. Uh, and in the Talmud, by the way, because Marav doesn't correspond directly to a specific sacrifice, there's the debate in the Talmud as to whether or not Marav is a reshut, which means something that is optional, like extra credit if you do it, or it's a chiyuv, it's something which is obligatory. Now it's become basically, for all intents and purposes, clearly obligatory to the point that if you miss Marav service, you have to do tashlumin, which means like a makeup at the next service and daven an extra amida. But nevertheless, it's not it doesn't correspond to one of the sacrifices. So fragments of prayers have been found in Qumran. Unfortunately, they're not in good shape at all. But the community rule presents the leader of the community as offering praises at appointed times, and he would say, with the offering on my lips, I bless him, being God, as a statute engraved forever. So the community rule tells us that you did have the leader of the community offering prayers with this particular phraseology here. Now we also have the song of the Shabbat sacrifice found in copies of Qumran and Masada, and it presents a hymn, or really a series of hymns recited by the angels. And it's unclear if this was recited at Qumran on Shabbat or not, this song of the Shabbat or Sabbath sacrifice. Certainly you would expect it would be, but we don't know for sure one way or the other. Okay, so here is the Hodai, the Thanksgiving hymn. So I'm sorry, this is the series of the series of different hymns, not the previously mentioned one. So the Hodaot or Thanksgiving, like the Hodaya section in the Amida, Modi'in, it's all the same Hebrew shoresh or root, which comes from Todah, Thanksgiving, Modeh, Modah, Todah. You're acknowledging God's goodness, you're giving thanksgiving. So we have there was about 25 individual hymns which begin Odecha Hashem. We have that in the Hala, Odecha Ki Anitani. I'll spare you the rest of the singing. But again, we have from Odecha, like Hodah, I will give thanks to God. So we have these 25 or so Thanksgiving hymns. So it's unclear. The order of the different Psalms is unclear because the texts have been found in fragments. So we don't necessarily know this was hymn 1, this was hymn 2. Unlike, let's say, Sefer Tehillim, the book of Psalms, which is very well structured. You have Psalm 1 and 2 and chapter 3 and 4 and that type of thing. Now, it does certainly in content and style, nevertheless, it certainly resembles Psalms. And some of these Psalms, the community relates to God, and others it's the individual really relates to God. And we still see that nowadays in most of our tefillah liturgy, quite honestly. We're talking to God in a community. Look at the phraseology of the Amida and all these, God, Avotenu, the God of our fathers, look at all the requests we make in the Amida are always in the plural. We beseech you, God, do this for us, God, do that for us, God. But then when we get to Eloheinu Tzor Lishoni Mira, which really comes in after the all the benedictions of the Amida are over, that's phrased in the individual. God guard my tongue from sin. As an individual, you're asking God. And the reason we have that is the Talmud says that after reciting all the blessings, the benedictions of the Amida, the brachot, you're supposed to make a personal request. And you can be able, you don't need to recite Eloheinu Tzor Lishoni Mira. You can make any personal request. The Talmud has different texts of prayers that different rabbis would like to recite. And that one just happened to find its way into the Siddur as something, if you don't know what to say, you always can fall back on that, but it's perfectly acceptable even nowadays to make your own personal partition. And I actually encourage people to. So it's really, you're speaking really more in a personal experience as opposed to reading somebody else's prayer. Okay. But the Psalms certainly present the sect theology, which really speaks of a glory of God, emphasis on reward and punishment, predestination, and the existence of angels. So these are all themes we've talked about before, and it certainly makes perfect sense that as they're writing these Psalms to praise God and help them with the relationship with God, they're hitting these key themes which they really believe in. Okay, so and they stress the development of dualism as well as the afterlife. In other words, there's good and there's bad. We're good, they're bad. We're the sons of light, they're the sons of dark. We get the afterlife. The bad guys who don't get the message or haven't been predestined and chosen already, they're standing in the afterlife. Well, not guaranteed like ours is. Okay. There's an omission of certain ideas too in the Psalms, which really gets our attention here. There's no mention of the prophets, prophetical Judaism's message, which is a message of that could be taken beyond Judaism. You think about a lot of these prophetic messages, prophetic Judaism, these idea of kindness and compassion for all. And I mean, these ideas clearly are found in the Torah as well, particularly in Devarim. And really, Devarim seems to be the catalyst, say for Devarim, Deuteronomy is the catalyst for really prophetic Judaism, prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, all of those type of prophets here. There's not really, we don't really have really very much of that, if anything, in these Qumran texts. And if you stop and think about it, it shouldn't be surprising at all. They basically take the point of view, our community is the elected community. We're the sons of light, they're the sons of dark. So you really have this very insular, it's us versus them mentality, as opposed to prophetic Judaism. Think about Isaiah's or Lagaim, light onto the nations. What's Isaiah's point really? He's saying we have a message here and everyone can benefit from the message. It's our job to be the teachers of that message, to disseminate God's message to the point where there's even an opinion in the Talmud that the galut, the exile, is an opportunity for us to take the show in the road and teach others. So that's certainly that's an opinion in Talmud. But we just don't really have that here. There's also no mention of the temple because their place takes their community takes the place of a temple. It's almost like the place that won't be mentioned at this point because it's so impure. And it says this, and just it's we have already said this, but it's really a particularistic point of view as opposed to a universal point of view. And we still have these conversations in Judaism today. How much emphasis should be put on helping your fellow Jew versus helping the greater community as a whole? And Judaism clearly encourages both. It's just a matter of degree. But here there's a very inward-looking community, and as we've already discussed, though people can join, the barriers are hard. It's a very rigorous initiation type of process. You mess up, you get into big trouble. So it's really an us versus them mentality. So this is an interpretation by Lawrence Schiffman, who we're basing a lot of our stuff on here. One of the lines from this from one of these Thanksgiving texts is, "I have been taken from dust, fashioned by clay, from a font of impurity and nakedness of shame." Okay, so God made me. I was impure. Now basically I've joined the sect and have purified myself. That's the Peshat, maybe we could say, the general message there, the basic message. Schiffman suggests that this font of impurity and nakedness is a reference to female genitalia, describing basically sexuality as something that's impure, that comes up in a negative light, and Judaism, I mean, that's really at odds with the basic view of Judaism has, where basically you think of marriage as called kiddushin, which means sanctification, and sexual activity in Judaism, assuming it's done in the appropriate manner, is considered a mitzvah. There's a famous story in the Talmud about the guy who goes to see this high class prostitute, and to make a long story short, what happens is basically, as she's undressing, his sit seat, his fringes, prayer fringes, which are or prayer garment, which he took him off, a garment, whatever you want to, you know what I'm talking about. His sit seat jump up off the floor and slap him in the face, and he realizes God is admonishing him for engaging in relations with a prostitute, which is strictly forbidden under Jewish law. She is at first she's insulted the prostitute, saying, "Well, you don't find me attractive. What's the problem?" He says, "No, it's not that." He explains to her what's going on here, and she says, "Wow, I really like these ideas. Can I go learn?" She learns Torah, converts to Judaism, and eventually they get married. The point of the story is that sexual behavior in Judaism, when done with in prostitution, is an avera. It's a sin. When it's done through marriage, it's a mitzvah. So it's not inherently bad. That's the point. On the other hand, we have a story from actually the end of this week's parsha here, when Miriam and Aharon speak negatively about Moshe, and it seems to be really Miriam, if you follow the grammar, implies that she's really the speaker of it. But she speaks, quote unquote, lashon hara, or something negative about Moshe. It's kind of unclear, but the way Chazal or sages look at it, basically what she's really saying is, she's saying this out of a place of care for Moshe. She's saying, why has Moshe stopped having relations with his wife Zipporah? He should have a normal family life like we do. Like, in other words, like I have with my husband, and Aaron has with his wife. We're prophets also, and we're able to have relations with our spouses regularly. And God goes ballistic and reams them out, dresses them down. Miriam and Aaron, for the mere suggestion, they are prophets like Moshe. In other words, he says to them, "Okay, it's very nice, you're prophets. I'm happy for you. I'm very impressed. However, you're not on the same level of Moshe. Don't even suggest you're on the same level of prophecy as Moshe." Now, why had Moshe separated from his wife? In other words, stopped having relations with her? Because he had to remain in a state of spiritual purity so he can talk to God regularly. So we do have this idea in certain venues, we want to be ritually pure and abstain from sexual relations. Think about on Yom Kippur, you're not allowed to have sexual relations. The Mishnah in Yoma even goes as far as to say they kept the Kohen Hagadol, the high priest, up the entire night before Yom Kippur, so he wouldn't fall asleep and be a Baal Keri, in other words, have a nocturnal emission, because that would make him impure. So we do have that stream of thought. In certain circumstances, you have to remain pure, which includes avoiding sex, but we don't have this idea in general that sex is bad or unclean or something. And again, done in the right manner, it's a mitzvah. It's a good thing. Is it a mitzvah to have for a husband and wife to have relations on Friday night? We have that thought, and that goes into the Kabbalah and mystical type of ideas as well. Now, I do want to point out from our last class, those who attended with Jews and Christian or Muslim lands, later on, more in the Middle Ages, this idea does pop up again. Perhaps that sex is something that's dirty or something like a much more prudish idea of sex. We find the guy's name doesn't. I remember Professor Ruderman said his name wasn't really important, but they found this letter which was circulating, distinguishing between the ways Jews and non-Jews engage in sexual relations. And clearly you hear that the Jewish guy, the writer of this letter, has is a polemic against non-Jews, really, where he's saying that the not non-Jews are constantly having sex, and it's really very derogatory. Like animals are constantly having sex, and that's all these people think about. The Jewish man, on the other hand, the circumcised, sophisticated Jewish man, he has sex with his wife maybe once a week, and just does it to kind of relieve his urges. But then the rest of the time, his mind is on more esoteric type of matters, spiritual type of matters. So later on, this type of idea does emerge again, but it really is in contrast with the idea that sex is something bad or to be avoided or limited, where Judaism, if anything, the conventional wisdom, I think, is correct, has a relatively opened and positive view, or has an opened and positive view of sexual relations done correctly. Okay. So how was the document? In other words, how was these Thanksgiving psalms used? So there's no evidence per se of liturgical use at Qumran, even though you certainly believe it was used. Now, Philo does note that the Therapeutae, which is an Essene-like group in Egypt, Philo is the leader of the Egyptian Jewish community, first century Common Era. He says that in this Essene-like group in Egypt, the leader would offer a commentary on scripture, something on the Torah, and then recite a hymn on, and then recite some sort of hymn on Shavuot, where where you could assume, at least it's likely, that members of the congregation there were reciting the hymn along with him. So we see in another community, we see similar type of psalms are used in a liturgical type of setting, and we see it in the temple in Jerusalem. Psalms are used liturgically in the sense where you had the Levim, the Levitical choir, would have this whole big Shir Shal Yom, Psalm of the Day, at the end of the worship, at the end of the sacrificial and the whole worship service. They would sing the Psalm of the Day, and we do this nowadays too. We say the Psalm of the Day, but nowadays it's the end. It's the end of the service. Everyone's tired. It's something that's done pretty quickly, and then we move on to Mortis Kaddish, and we're finishing up the service. If it's on Shabbat, everyone wants to get in and get a goodie at Kiddush. So in the temple in Jerusalem, however, there was a whole choir with musicians. It was a big deal. Now, granted that the rest of they didn't have perhaps as long of a davening as we have, because basically this was tacked on to the Psalm of the Day was probably tacked on to the end of the sacrificial service as opposed to our service. It's the end of the davening, which is tacked on to more and more davening. So you could see why it was a bigger deal, because there was less of it. There was less davening. So when they davened to recite it, the psalm was a bigger deal than when we recited it. We've already done a lot of davening, so it's just kind of the last piece. Okay. Right. So they believe that in Egypt, the leader of the community would kind of lead it, but others would recite the psalm along with him. So certainly possible, and one would suspect probably something like this went on at Qumran, though we don't know for sure. So, by the way, next lecture we're going to talk about the politics of Qumran Hebrew. So, as nowadays we're all quite aware of, language itself often conveys all sorts of political messages. Nothing new under the sun, as Shlomo Hamelech, King Samuel says. So we'll talk about that next week. In the meantime, let me X out. We'll go to Q&A. Okay, so I have this big note in my screen. This meeting is being recorded. All right, I'm not gonna touch anything. I'll just leave the note where it is. Okay, any Any questions, comments? We covered a fair amount of ground today. No questions, comments? I think that's a first. Maybe I should make a shachiano. No one has a question or
You
comment. Wow.
mentioned dualism, and I've forgotten what that means.
So, okay, good question, Mark. So dualism basically is this belief in there are forces of good and forces of evil. So, which I mean, in its sense, in itself is nothing particularly revolutionary. I mean, we know there's good and evil in the world. We have even go back to the Gan Eden, Garden of Eden, the tree of life of good, tree of knowledge of good and evil. In other words, you get knowledge, you have knowledge, you could choose to do good or evil. But what happens is later on you have, and the Qumran sect themselves starts to dabble in this a little bit as well. And almost you have this evil is not just something that's in the world to deal with that people do, but you have these forces of evil which almost can rival God or be enemies of God. So they start to dabble, and they think of later on, like in certain parts of Christian thought. I don't know which parts or how widespread, but you think about, instead of the Satan or Satan being God's prosecuting angel or God's helper in some sense, he challenges God. So Qumran, they got into that a little bit. Scott, I know we've spoken about that. Do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, just from what you've been teaching over the weeks, I mean, we're good, they're bad. I mean, it makes sense that they had this concept of dualism. It seems to pervade everything that they did. I mean,
No, but didn't we talk about once Bila, where like Bolea, like a force that is an opposition? Okay, I thought we.
Belial.
Yeah, Belial.
Yeah, I mean, they heavily relied on that, on the Belial, the evil, and they use it in a lot of their interpretations.
Most commonly, the thing that I'm aware of is there was a whole school that was very dualistic, and there's I think the Greek thought was very dualistic, which is the spiritual world is good and the physical world is bad or not as good, and the idea that that there was this hierarchy of goodness or not goodness based on how spiritual you were. And that's something that carries over into Christianity as well.
Okay, so yeah, so that's a good example, and later you get these ideas develop about how you should really concentrate more about prepare yourself for the heavenly world as opposed to focusing on your life in this world, and that seeps into Judaism to a degree where you have rabbinic statements like this world is simply a vestibule for Olam Haba, for the world to come. But again, just to answer your question a very just direct way, it's really the idea that there's good versus evil, and evil really can challenge, and at least into certain belief systems, becomes a challenge to God, as opposed to God gives people free will and they just happen to do evil.
Rabbi,
and we'll talk about this. We'll talk about this a little more specifically as I prepare for the last few lectures. We're actually going to get more into this type of idea. Go ahead, Scott.
Did you in an earlier lecture talk about something about tefillin or something found at Qumran, or that was something else? I mean, did they wear tefillin? I'm curious.
Yes, we spoke about it. They found tefillin at Qumran. Yes, I think it's the oldest found tefillin that's ever been found. Were the ones found in Qumran. Some of them were just simply the parchment, and others they found basically tefillin and something that looks like a pair of tefillin we would have in some sort of bayit, some sort of box.
Well, that would be
So-
interesting. It would be, well, how did they use it? Did they use it for prayer? Did they use it just to wear?
They think they used it for prayer, as we discussed. Basically, I mean, the Greek word is phylacteries, which doesn't really do it justice. Prayer is like prayer accoutrement, something they use while you're davening. And by the way, it seemed to be early at an earlier period. It may have been guys ran around wearing tefillin all during daylight hours, and eventually the rabbis, this is in the Talmud, really decide that's not a good idea for men to wear tefillin all day, and basically just limit it to shachrit. Anyone take a guess why? Did you come across this yet, Alan and Daf Yomi?
I don't remember Daf Yomi, but I think, I don't remember seeing it in Daf Yomi, but it seems to me that in Barachot, there's a lot of talk about whether men can wear tefillin when they're relieving themselves in the outhouse or something like this as to what to do. So,
That's exactly the reason. Is obviously we all know you're not supposed to go in and wear tefillin in the bathroom. Anything of God's name, it's a strict no to take that into the bathroom. So that's but the rabbis take it a step further, and they say in order to wear tefillin, you have to have a guf nakeh, which means a clean body. You're not supposed to have the urge to go to the bathroom either. And if you do, you're supposed to take them off, do what you need to do, and then put them back on. So the rabbis basically said, in order to avoid people wearing tefillin, and let's say there's no place for them to go to the bathroom, and then they basically said, you limit it to shachrit, your morning davening, and then you take them off. Now, when I was in Israel 2 years ago, last time, I saw these yeshiva bacher looking kids, teenagers. It was later in the day. The sun was still up, but clearly later in the day. I think I was walking around the old city looking for a pizza place or something like that for dinner already. And I see these young guys walking around wearing tefillin. So I guess this was a very minority group that decided they're going to wear tefillin all day. It's frowned upon simply because of the issue of guf nakeh. And by the way, that's one of the issues with women and wearing tefillin. Also revolves around women and menstruation. Even though there's Michal, who's the referring to the daughter of Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, wears tefillin, and there's actually no objection raised in the Talmud itself, and there is no prohibition on a woman wearing Talmud. It's just the custom is basically, the obligation is on men. Women can but don't have to, and it's become customary basically most at least in orthodox circles for women not to, even though in more liberal circles it's become common again. We know they do. So but that you understand why people do or don't do something. By the way, Tosafot, he's the commentary Tosafot in the Talmud brings up the issue of, well, we have a concern what happens if a woman is menstruating. Would it be appropriate for her to wear tefillin? And later on, the Ramah, who's the Ashkenazic Lus and the Shulchan Aruch, basically just gives you a cultural answer, which is not a legal answer. Basically, just saying we're not comfortable with this. So that's completely cultural. It depends when you're living and that type of stuff. But if you were to ask me, can a woman wear tefillin? I think the answer is clearly yes. Culturally, how people react to it is a different story. But a simple legal issue, it seems to be clear from the Talmud that there's not a problem with it. Other questions? No? Okay, so thank you everyone for joining me again. Thank you for recording, Alan. And